Welcome to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast. I'm Greg Drevenstedt, Editor-in-Chief at Rider Magazine. Our guest today is Eric Trow. Eric and I both started working at Rider in 2008, back when I was a very green road test editor. Eric writes the Riding Well column, as well as safety tips and special features. Eric is a gifted writer and a great storyteller, and his columns and features are very popular with readers. Eric Trow is a lifelong motorcyclist, a renowned motorcycling proficiency expert, and a recipient of the AMA Outstanding Road Rider Award. He developed the modern Stayin Safe method of advanced rider training, and Stayin Safe Training Tours are available through Moto Mark 1. In this episode, I talk with Eric about his background in motorcycle skills training and how he got involved with Rider Magazine. He shares the backstory on two of his popular features published in Rider, Chasing Gene and Washie and Parker Discovers America. And we learn what motorcycles Eric has in his garage, from his grandfather's 1953 Indian Chief to his newly acquired Honda Trail 90. Eric and I had a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy this episode as much as we did recording it. If you want to get Eric's columns and all the great content in Rider Magazine in your mailbox every month, go to ridermagazine.com and subscribe. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here, Greg.
I often do these podcasts with people that I've not met before, and I'm kind of getting to know them during the interview, but I've had a chance to meet a couple times in person. Then, of course, we've communicated many times over the phone and email and stuff. So, but it's good to see your face on this video call. The podcast, of course, is just audio, but we're both sporting our beards, and you're in Pennsylvania and I'm in California.
Exactly. Folks, if you could see the beard that he has, I mean, it's just an incredible full beard. So I'm envious.
Yeah, I've taken to saying that I've gone kind of fully woolly. I got sort of lazy and I'm just letting it go. So what some people may not realize that like we've been doing this podcast for a while. You did one of the first episodes back when Mark Tuttle was still editor and really sort of kicked off the podcast. But you and I both have been working with Rider Magazine about the same amount of time. I started as a staffer back in March of 2008. I was green, didn't know anything, had no industry experience, and had a lot to learn. And I learned a lot from Mark Tuttle and from some other folks. But you started writing your column, Riding Well, which still is in every issue of Rider Magazine, but you started at the September of 2008 issue. So how did you get involved with Rider?
Well, that started with really through Larry Grodzki, and of course, who was the predecessor who wrote the Stayin Safe column in Rider for many years. And Larry's a Pittsburgh guy. I'm a Pittsburgh guy. And we had both been in the motorcycle training business in the Pittsburgh area. And I got to know Larry very well. In fact, what's kind of my relationship with him, he was somebody that I guess folks who knew both of us were saying, hey, you guys should know each other. Larry was looking for some help with some of his on-road training tours. And I was working with the MSF program in the parking lots. So when I was introduced to him, I thought the idea of helping him out was, you mean I don't have to stand in the middle of a parking lot watching other people ride motorcycles? Wow, that's cool. But anyway, through all of that, got to know Larry very well, and I'm a writer by trade, had already been. And the unfortunate thing, as we all know, Larry passed, and then there was a void in the magazine that Mark, after a period of time, felt that there was a need to fill it, and I was really honored to be approached to fill that. And so that's kind of how all that started. It didn't start in the way you'd want it to start, but
sure.
But it's been a great ride.
I never had the opportunity to meet Larry. He had passed before I started working at the magazine, before my time. I've read quite a bit of his stuff previously published in the magazine. And he's one of those people that just had, I know readers loved him. They just like they loved Clement Salvadori. He just had a way with words, and to write a column about safety, which is the way that you picked up the mantle in a similar way, which is, it's not really about diagrams and sort of the sort of like almost like a textbook approach to riding, but it's more of philosophy and ways in which you tell stories that people can relate to them, and then there's kind of a moral to the story. There maybe is a lesson to be learned and so forth. And so it's been like I said, he was a great part of the magazine. You've been obviously a great part of the magazine as well. So yeah, it's been a pleasure to get to know you and your writing over the years. So
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. And it's been, and I have to say, it's been really cool to, in recent months, to really be able to free up the style and um, tell stories the way that I really like to be able to tell stories. And if there's a lesson in it, then great. For years, that was the first years, it was, I'm a big believer of people, at least I know, I learn things by comparing it to other things that I'm already familiar with. So if you want to teach an unfamiliar concept, tie it to something familiar. So a lot of times that's borrowing on life. Well, now what's great is just being able to convey stories that people hopefully can relate to. And that it's been fantastic to get some of the feedback and be able to correspond with some of the readers. And I don't know if I'm sure you run into this as well. We put stuff out there, and then you hope it resonates.
Yeah, it's a little scary. I think if I thought about it too much, that would probably spook me. So I often don't. I'm not really writing for an audience or as much as I know that people are going to read it. But yeah, you never really know what's going to fall with people. There was, again, like over the years, Ryder has had the great fortune to have some just really excellent writers, whether they were columnists, people like yourself or Larry or Clement Salvadori, Grace Butcher. There was various people over the years that have really written stuff that really resonated with people. And then, of course, there have been staffers over the years and lots of folks. And then, of course, contributors, Melissa Holbrook Pearson, who everybody knows her book, The Perfect Vehicle, and some of her other books. She wrote an essay in Ryder in 1992. That was 5 years before her book was published. There was this kind of long form essay, and the July issue that we just finished, that'll be coming out in a few weeks. We have an essay of hers called Connected, which is really about her going on the slimy crud run that's in Wisconsin a couple times a year. It's made pretty famous by Peter Egan. And she's got this kind of really interesting personal, essay about it. And so, yeah, to bring, additional voices into the magazine where it's not, people want to read about motorcycles. We have motorcycle tests, we have travel stories. That's our kind of bread and butter or meat and potatoes. But, really what makes a publication, I think, rich and really draws people in is the columns, it's the features. I know you've written a couple of features as well that have really resonated with people. And, that's what we really hope to bring to readers, because we're really trying to distinguish ourselves from Instagram and Facebook and websites and stuff where it's almost like it is a news feed. And it's almost like just this constant stream of noise and pictures and things like that, but where people can have the physical magazine, sit down with it and enjoy it. So.
Oh, absolutely. And kudos to you, man. I really do believe, and you and I've talked about this, and it's just, I really love what's happening here with the publication, because to me, we're really capturing why we all love motorcycling, the passion that we have. It's not always around the mechanics of the motorcycle and
right.
The aesthetic appeal or anything like that. That's a part of it, but there are so many reasons that we all ride, and I think that's coming to life. I just love the stories that I'm reading every month, and it's just really cool to be a part of that.
We're lucky that we work for a magazine that is still in print. There are a few others that are still out there, but major names, Cycle World, Motorcyclist, Motorcycle Consumer News, ones that I always subscribe to, look forward to reading every month. I got to know people that worked at those magazines. I look forward to reading their reviews and comparisons and stories and so forth. And they may still exist in some form online, but that's generally not how I want to consume most of my motorcycle media. I really do enjoy a physical mag. I spend so many hours of my day on it, like you and so many other people, on my computer, and I create the content, but I much prefer the professional layouts. Our art director, Chad, does a great job. We're really fortunate to work with Kevin Wing on, almost every issue. We've got these fantastic covers he's been doing, and he sort of set a high bar early on. I was like, hey, let's kind of go back, because Ryder used to do those sorts of, scenic covers that really don't have a lot of text on the cover, and it's really sort of be an inspirational thing. As soon as you see it, you're like, I want to be there. I want to be on that road. I want to be on that motorcycle. I want to have that experience. But a lot of readers won't. They won't ride that particular motorcycle. They won't be on that particular road. So the idea is, of course, is, with the writing and the photography and the stories and so forth, is to inspire people, and it's inspirational and aspirational. So,
yep. Well, what's cool is I think what's captured when you talk about the covers and a lot of the photography that's inside, but the covers in particular, that connects with me in a way of, those are the things when I look at the covers, I say, that's what I dreamt of as a kid. That's I just wanted to be, the idea of traveling, to get out there, and how magical that was,
right,
to be on two wheels and do it, even though I really didn't have the opportunity to go all that far as a little kid, other than as a passenger with my dad to the store or something. But that was just so. Yeah, that brings it back to me every time I see a cover or that type of photography.
Well, so speaking of that, you're talking about as a kid. I know you come from a motorcycling family. Your dad rode motorcycles. Your grandfather raced back in the early decades of the 20th century, and even owned an Indian agency, as they used to call dealerships. Right. So tell us a little bit like what it was like to grow up around motorcycles. Because my dad had a motorcycle when I was a kid, but he didn't ride it that much, and it was I didn't learn to ride until I was in my 20s. But I mean, you were steeped in that.
Yeah, that was. It was I feel like I was really fortunate to grow up in that environment. I mean, my grandfather, now, by the way, yes, my dad rode and was an avid rider. It's that when we talk about Gene, my grandfather, that's actually my mother's father. And he was, it was a rural dealership in southwestern Pennsylvania, near a little town called Uniontown and Brownsville. It was kind of right in between. And he had been a dealer from about 1926 all the way up through really through the mid 70s, I'd say. And then he sold out and just kind of would putter over there and everything. But I mean, that's where I spent my summers. That was, my earliest memories are of my family would go up there, and I just remember, I distinctly remember my dad and my brother, who's 5 years older than I am, and then me, all three of us stacked on like an old Honda Trail 55 or whatever it was, and riding around the yard and through the tall grass. There were a couple acres at the house, and then the house, by the way, was across the street from the shop, and then there was another 7 acres behind the shop of wooded area. And so it was a great place to ride. And what I used to do is, I loved hanging out there anytime I could, and just listening to and looking at all the different motorcycles that came in. By the time I was around, it was Hondas, and he sold BSA, and there were Triumphs, and of course there were the Indians that were still kind of left over, all of his buddies and everything. He was an Indian man all the way through. So, it's kind of funny. I think back to when my brother and I, we watched and listened to these, and were so fascinated with these motorcycles and motorcyclists that we actually got to be really, really good at imitating the sounds of the bikes. Here's what a BSA 650 sounds like, and here's what a Honda 754 sounds like. And we would do that and run around the yard with our arms outstretched and our tongues hanging out, making motor sounds, pretending we were riding. Which was really silly for him because he was 5 years older than, it was okay for me when I was little. But anyway, and then so I would spend my summers at the shop. And while later on, when all my friends were going to summer camp and playing baseball and all that sort of thing, I would go and hang out at the shop. I swept floors, worked there, watched and learned how to turn wrenches. And I was allowed to ride any trade-in that could come in that I could swing a leg over and still touch the ground. And if I was able to start it, and just about everything was kickstart, then I was permitted to ride it, with a couple exceptions. And so I got cool. I got really good at riding, but I really sucked at baseball.
So, you wrote a feature that was in the February issue of Rider called Chasing Gene and Washie. I want to go into that a little bit, and I think it was in one or two of your columns, you talked about, when you were at the shop when you were a kid, there was, like you said, your dad used to hang out with guys that he used to race with. They used to ride together, and you basically kind of had these old timers sitting around telling stories. And that just must have been just a great place to just sit around as a little kid and just absorb that like a sponge.
Greg, that made it such a cool thing. To hear, a lot of people, I guess, would look just see these guys in some other setting and just say, oh, these are some old guys. What was so cool, though, is it was so dynamic to sit and listen to these guys tell these stories. Now, I'm sure they were embellished over the years, too, especially when I think back on some of the stuff that they described. I'm sure those stories got a little bigger than life over time. But I just remember the laughter and the ribbing that they would do. I mean, my grandfather was an Indian man, and it's not like, there was a friendly rivalry, but they were always talking about the Indian versus the Harley boys and all that kind of stuff. And although even my grandfather sold a Harley for a little while too. But these guys would tell tales of, in fact, in that story, there's some talk about when we took the ride down to Winchester Speedway, and we went outside of Uniontown. There's the ride up Route 40 to Summit Mountain, the ride up Summit Mountain. And that was the road that I always heard about, that those guys that was their neighborhood, really kind of racetrack. That's where they would check to see, they would see how much, as they put it, how much soup their bikes had, to go up the hill. And I just remember hearing about, a couple of the guys like leaning over so far that they were levering the rear tires off off the pavement and trying to, it was really kind of wild to hear all that stuff. And my grandfather was a master storyteller. He was just, I wish I had that gift. He was just so incredible. And you know how when somebody's telling a story and they start laughing as they're recalling it, as they tell the story, it's just so infectious. And that's the way that was.
Right.
And even though they would tell a lot of the same stories over and over again, I would still prompt them to tell the stories just so I could hear that.
Well, it's interesting. Those, folks, especially good storytellers, but people, they get enjoyment out of telling the story. They like telling it over and over. I mean, good storytellers, you refine it over time. You add, embellish, you do whatever. Right. I mean, it's like it's not just a line by line accounting of we did this and we did that. But
right.
So when you you're this refer to this feature, Chasing Gene and Washie. So Gene is your grandfather. Right. Gene Townsend, and Washie is Floyd
Washabaugh.
And they were buddies. They raced together. They hung out together. They rode, and they had a club, didn't they?
Yeah. Gene Scouts Motorcycle Club. It was an AMA club, and they actually sanctioned some racing events. They actually had a TT track down a couple miles from the shop on my grandfather's family property down there. And but they, it was also a social club and riding club that they would, they would organize rides and that sort of thing, which made sense with the shop and everything too. So Gene and Washie both were active. They were flat track racers. And I would assume that just about everybody now, fortunately, flat track's making a comeback, which is so great to see. But that's the half-mile dirt track, kind of like you'd see a lot of them were horse tracks, and and then the stock car tracks, so those guys both did it. My grandfather was a bit older than Washie was, but and Gene Scouts actually sponsored Washie when he turned pro for a year. He was an AMA pro racer on the flat track circuit too. And that was really, really a cool thing. And of course, that was, a lot of the stories that we heard too. I used to hear about them running down to, they'd all ride to the tracks. Occasionally somebody would stuff a motorcycle into the back of a truck, or even better, in the back of a sedan or something, and take it down to the track, take the fenders off, take the headlight off, and run them. And then hopefully they had something that they could ride back home when they were done. So, that was always something that I had connected with. And then I imagine what you're probably going to ask is, how in the world did this story come about?
Yeah.
And I was at Williams Grove for the flat track races just a handful of years ago, and was introduced to Ron Washabaugh, who is Washie's grandson. So similar situation to mine with Gene. And he and I started talking and learned that we both just had still this incredible passion for motorcycles, for Indian motorcycles, for racing, and just had this incredible connection and appreciation for our grandfathers. And the more we shared stories, the more things overlapped, and we just immediately created this tremendous friendship, and talked about, wouldn't it be cool to retrace their steps? I mean, it talked about, is the shop still there? Yeah, the shop's still there. Well, we should meet up there sometime. And then it was, well, why don't we, they always talked about Winchester. Why don't we take a ride to Winchester or up to Langhorne or something like that? And that became exploring whether the Winchester Speedway was even still there, or could we find it, and then finding it's still there. And so we decided to pull together a ride. And the really cool part was both of our sons ride and are into it. And so here you had the great grandsons joining in on the ride. And so that's what we decided to do, is we retraced the steps, and we're chasing Gene and Washie from the old Indian agency in near Uniontown down to the Winchester Speedway in Winchester, Virginia.
Well, it's a great story. It resonated with a lot of our readers, and I've got quite a bit of feedback about it. But one of the things I loved about it is the visual component. Is you had a photographer with you to capture, you and Ron and your son Parker, and I don't know what Ron's son's name is. I don't recall his name, but. Mm-hmm. But that you guys, so you and the bikes and the places that you visited, so you had some contemporary photos of what the Winchester Speedway is like. You went to the cemetery where one or both of your grandfathers were buried.
Yeah, they're both there. Mm-hmm.
To some of these sites along the way on these, but you were able to use some archival photos of, your grandfather and Washie and, their buddies at races at some of these locations. And so you can it's like this then and now sort of thing, which it just adds a whole other level to it. So I, definitely encourage people, if they can look up that issue, February 2022 issue, the feature Chasing Gene and Washie. It's really one of the, better ones we've done in a long time. So kudos to you, man. So
thanks. It was really cool to be able to have those photos. And, as you were saying that, I'm just realizing, where did I find those photos? Some of them were in boxes and everything, but I just realized how many of those, especially the old racing shots and some of the old ride shots, they used to be tucked into in between the glass and the wood of the old showcase in the shop. So I remember seeing those pictures, from the time I was a wee little kid, at least some of them. That were featured in the story. So it was really cool to have to kind of reenact it to some degree. And like I told you, it's like, just like we were talking about the covers, is like, you see a picture, you see these photos and say, oh man, that just looks like so much fun what these guys are doing. And so that's what we did.
Very cool. One thing you may or may not be aware of, so we have our companion or sister publication at EPG. It used to be called Thunder Press. So they just recently changed the title to American Rider. And the editor is, for the past year or so, has been Kevin Duke. And since the magazine focuses on American motorcycles, so that's obviously going to be Harley Davidsons and Indians and so forth. But he's been working with two of his regular contributors, TJ Rafferty and Kip Woodring. And he has these, what are called kind of the obscurity files each issue. And then the companion to that is Making Their Mark. And it's about, basically the early American motorcycle, because there were several hundred motorcycle manufacturers in the first half of the 20th century, definitely in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And so doing in-depth stuff about Crocker and Excelsior and Flying Merkel and Cyclone and so forth. So again, it's just as you have this rich personal history and your grandfather was involved in racing in the early days of Indian, it's really great to see that what Kevin's doing with his contributors to really document a lot of this stuff and have it be in this magazine, because at some point I think it would make a great book to have these, there's always a companion of the obscurity files and the Making Their Mark, these two different approaches about it's the innovators, the racers, the engineers, the rise and fall of some of these companies that came and went. And it's interesting because, we take for granted the manufacturers we have today in many ways. There's Honda, there's Harley Davidson, there's Indian and so forth, but kind of what the roots of motorcycling is, at least in this country in particular. So
yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. That's fantastic.
So you said that you and Parker were on this ride together for Chasing Gene and Washie. So last summer in the August issue, you had a feature called Parker Discovers America. And so that was about a cross-country trip you did with Parker when he was 18. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
That was, I remember distinctly how that whole thing started. And I never did think it would materialize, by the way. He was 13. Yeah, because it was 5 years earlier. He was 13 and hanging out with me in the garage, as he often did, which was always cool to me. In fact, one of my favorite memories of Parker from when he was a little kid, and I just think it's really great when you can get your kids exposed to, just as I was, get them exposed to motorcycling and see what it's all about and build their passion for it. But Parker always had an interest in motorcycles. In fact, I remember when he was about, he was probably 4 years old. And he was watching me work on an old motorcycle, and I was having trouble with something. And of course, doing my, oh, come on, what do you, and I'm struggling with something with a carburetor on the bike or trying to fit something. And he's saying, well, Dad, what if you just, and it's like, I'd look at him, Parker, really, I know what I'm doing here. And I go a little bit further, and he's, well, Dad, I'm just thinking if you, Parker, really? Okay, I'm good. Just give me a second. And of course, this went on for a little bit. And finally I said, what, Parker, what? Well, if you just take this and you flip that up, Parker, you can't do, wait a minute, what? And sure enough, his little uncluttered mind had it all figured out. And it was a quick fix, and I should have listened to him in the first place, which I've kind of learned now that I tend to turn to him sometimes for some of the answers. But anyway, for starting this trip, it was once again in the garage. I was working on an old BMW that I had at the time. And I said, you know what, Parker? I said, it just dawned on me that I rode a bike just like this one across the country. I said, it's been 20 years. I said, I should do a 20-year anniversary ride. It would be really kind of fun to do that. And he said, well, wait 5 years and make it 25th, and I'll go with you, meaning on his own bike.
Sure.
And I said, man, that's a great idea. I love this. And so we were both all excited about it. And then as time went on, I thought, oh, he's going to be, he was so active in so many different activities and dating and all that stuff. I thought, okay, he's going to lose interest in this. And we'd touch base, we'd talk about it periodically. He's like, and every time he's like, no, I'm all in. Yeah. And so what we did is we spent really 5 years casually planning what would our ride be like. And we decided, I had introduced him to a book that really inspired me in many ways that I really liked. And it's not a motorcyclist book, but it's a traveling book called Blue Highways. And
fantastic.
And it's all about riding traveling the old federal highways, the old 2 lanes. And so that's what we wanted to do. And that was the idea, was to immerse him into small town America, let him see, because I had been exposed to a lot of that. And I said, I really want him to see some of this stuff and experience it. And that's also my preferred way of traveling. I'm not much of an interstate rider. It's just not my thing.
Right.
And it's a completely different experience when you can take the old 2 lanes and actually go through towns. And so that's what we did, and wound up doing a big loop kind of across the center of the country. Well, yeah, just wound up working our way over to ultimately to San Diego, where the girls met us, and we stopped for a couple of days, and then we rode up the California coast. My brother got to join us for part of that because he lives in LA, so he rode with us a good ways north, and then we came across through Nevada and worked our way back across, and it was just really such a great mix of it was just really cool to see a young man just absolutely fall in love with this country and with small town America, and knowing that when you're passing somebody walking down the street and they say, hey, good morning, how are you? And they pause, it's like, oh no, they actually want to know, Parker, let's take it. It's like we can take a break and actually talk to somebody for a change. And that was really a neat experience. So in addition to the riding, it's just what you encounter and the culture and everything else is what makes it so great.
I mean, not only what you see in terms of the vistas and the roads, but you stop in small cafes, you're at gas stations where it's local folks. I mean, that was a number of years ago when you did that trip. I don't know how old Parker is now, but he was 18 at the time. When did you take that trip?
Yeah, he was 18, and Parker's older now.
Yeah, so I mean, but
I'm the same age, so he's catching up.
Yeah. I mean, but it's interesting that you say that, because I mean, a great thing about that story, and I'll include links to both Chase and Gene and Washie and Parker Discovers America in the show notes because we've got online versions of those stories. But, there's a sidebar to Parker Discovers America where he basically kind of reflects on what it was like to be an 18-year-old and to ride with his dad. And maybe that's not what a lot of 18-year-olds want to do, is go take a trip with their father. But it was, it sounds like it was a really transformative journey for both of you. It was a bonding experience. You guys dealt with heat and rain and all kinds of weather, and you did some camping.
And with each other.
Yeah.
We dealt with, that was either going to be a really great experience or it had all the potential to be really terrible. But fortunately, it was fantastic.
And you guys have done a number of, you guys do a number of big trips in the years since. You kind of set the pattern that you guys have been able to repeat for years, and that's got to be a really special thing for you.
It is. Once again, that I think that triggered, he had traveled with me, riding pillion, riding with me as a co-rider when he was younger, obviously before he got his license. But so he fell in love with travel, and that trip just sealed it. And we have done cross-country trips since then on different motorcycles, and we're currently planning something else. We're not exactly sure what it's going to be.
Right.
But he and his wife, they both ride, and they love to travel themselves too, which is great. And it's just really a fun thing, and I look forward to it. And in fact, we both get to the point of when we say, "Hey, it's been too long since we've taken an epic ride. We need to do something."
Right. Well, I'm sure that I commend you for making that trip happen, that Parker stuck through it. Because like when I was 14, my father and I, my parents had divorced. I was living in Atlanta. He was living down in Florida. He had an old van, and we basically took, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks, and we drove up the Eastern Seaboard. Cool. And I was into mountain biking at the time, so we had a couple of bikes, and so we avoided big cities for the most part, and we slept in the van, and I just basically saw parts of the country I'd never seen before, and it was this great trip. And we would, park the van out on some overlook and sit there and watch the sun go down or something. It was a great trip. And then years later, I was living with my father in Florida when I was a senior in high school, and I was getting kind of like, man, I don't really want to know if I want to go to college yet. And we were talking about doing a cross-country trip where we do like, hey, we did that for 3 or 4 weeks, and we just went up the East Coast, but let's take a year and just, live out of a van and go. This is definitely before #van life. And
right.
We had this great idea to do this trip. And then honestly, once I didn't do what Parker did. Once I graduated from high school, I think I just had other priorities. I got kind of chicken because we didn't really have any money. It was definitely going to be a shoestring kind of a trip.
Happens. Yeah.
And I just chickened out. And that's one of those things, like, if you have regrets in life, it's often about the things that you didn't do. It's not really the things that you did do, like an opportunity that was missed, because just it was a bonding experience with you and Parker, and that 3-week trip I did with my dad. I've even got a travel journal from back then. I know Parker kept a journal about his trip. But I was like, what would it have been like to have, and I went on to college just, right after high school and did all those things. I was like, but just like, some people that go backpacking around Europe for a summer or a year, it's like college is not going anywhere. You can always go back. And so that's one of those things I regret. So, yeah. But
I remember it was, and a lot of times work got in the way for me with some of the things too. And I remember a friend of mine saying something very poignant. And that was, he said, I don't remember any one of those things that was so important at work that required all this, time and making, and missing out on some of the trips that I'd planned and things like that. But I can tell you every trip that I missed, or every experience that I missed. And I just, I took that to heart and just said, okay, you gotta make the time in any way that you can. You're certainly making up for it. And, and I'm trying to do the same thing too, but it happens to all of us, no matter what we do and no matter how much, wanderlust you have or anything like that, you still wind up saying, well, the responsibilities are there and the whole bit. So, it's striking that balance because those things are just so rewarding and refueling, and you grow with every one of those things. Those are the things that I remember most, and I just feel really fortunate that I've got family members who enjoy doing it too and sharing it.
Sure.
Like I know you just did a big trip with your wife, and it's such a great way to spend time together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting with travels is that sometimes it's, uncomfortable. It's like, like we were traveling by motorcycle and we had a heat wave in Greece and we got rained on and we were on some challenging roads, but it's sort of like, in the moment, sometimes you may be a little bit inconvenienced or uncomfortable or a little bit unsure, especially being in foreign countries. It's like you may be a little bit unsure.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Greece, road signs are in Greek. It's all Greek. And that's a pretty inscrutable, alphabet, and so,
Yeah.
but, at the same time, it becomes one of those things where then around the dinner table, we were with a group and you're having some beers and you're talking about the day and you're having laughs about the challenges about, all those goat herds we had, herds of goats we had to ride through on this, rural road or something like that. So those are the sorts of things that also break us out of our routine of, Americans are great at being very hardworking, productive people. We're typically very bad at taking vacations. I mean, it's just compared to other countries that have a much more it's culturally ingrained to take a month off every summer. And Americans, sometimes you have 2 weeks of vacation. Some people don't take those 2 weeks. And now I work for a company where they give us unlimited vacation, which means that most people take even less than they used to when they started accumulating.
I've been in that scenario.
It's like once you have it, it's like, if I kind of use it or lose it. Now I don't. So it's like it really is important for people to make the time for, like, whether it's a motorcycle trip or a family trip or a vacation, or to do something to not only reward yourself for your hard work, but to break yourself out of the rat race that everybody always talks about.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
So I want to talk to you about what you've got in your garage. I know you've got some new acquisitions. You've also got some bikes you've had all around for a long time. You're talking about Gene. I know you have one of his original Indian motorcycles. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's something I'm so glad that never went away. This is an interesting story. Well, of course, you should never say this is going to be interesting, because it couldn't be interesting. Every possibility it won't be interesting at all. In the corner of the shop, from the time, as far back as I can remember, there was an orange, or the color is tangerine, Indian chief that sat in the back in the corner, and it was always chained to so that it couldn't be stolen or anything like that, but sat in the dark corners. And it was always something that I would kind of gravitate toward. And then I started, when I was old enough, I started to ask more about it. And my grandfather had been, like I said, very loyal to Indian. He established over the years, Pennsylvania is not that far from the factory in Springfield, Massachusetts. So he would drive up there on a fairly regular basis, sometimes just to pick up motorcycles, and while he, and to do service schools and all that sort of thing. He developed a very good relationship, in fact, a really strong relationship with folks up there at the Indian factory. In particular, the head of engineering, which was an older guy named Earl Pop Armstrong. And it was almost like, Pop was old enough to really be, it was pretty close, I think, to being old enough to be my grandfather's dad, so just to give you an age reference. And they just really had a fondness for each other and developed a relationship over time. And then through the years, when Indian was going out of production, ceasing production of the American motorcycles, they went on to carry the name. They were bought by a company called Brockhouse out of England, and which distributed British motorcycles primarily. And so they were rebadging Royal Enfields, for instance, as Indians. Those were the Indian Enfields. But the last of the American Indians were built in 1953. When that was happening, when all of that production was shutting down, my grandfather got a call, and they said, Gene, and this story was consistent through all the years. And you have to keep in mind, back then, Indians weren't worth anything. They were a motorcycle that was out of business. Right. And they, so the story always was very, very consistent. They said, they called and they said, Gene, we have enough parts to build about 10 more bikes. They had just did a run of, I think it was 50 police motorcycles. And so they had parts built, and they said, you can't really make any choices. He said, here's the color it's going to be. And we're out of chrome handlebars. It's going to have a lot of the police components, because that's what they had. So it had a police generator on it. It had the police style carburetor, which by that point, Indians had British Amel carburetors on them and stuff. And so there were some things on it that are quite a bit unusual. And that bike then, what's really cool about that is at the same time, he was also offered from the engineering department The story was that they said, well, Gene, if that bike stops running for any reason, what are you going to do? And he says, well, I guess I'll push it. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, here's something we're going to send to you. And they sent him another engine for it that had been in the engineering department, where they had kind of been hopping it up and stuff like that. And so that was never started and was on a crate. I used to turn it over by hand with a special tool that was made for that. And that unfortunately disappeared a few years ago. It was sold. Somebody talked my grandfather into selling it. But the bike itself has stayed in the family and still has less than 3,000 original miles on it. It's still has the original tires on it. It's exactly the way it was when I was a little kid. And the neat part is I've got photos of that back into the mid 50s. And all through the years. And it's just a neat thing to have. And it's got such a great story. And, I've had some people look at it and say, well, that's not an original 53 because it doesn't have this or that or whatever. And it's like, well, I don't care. This is what it is. Whether you believe it or not. And so that's been a real gem. And more to me, that's the bike that I climbed on. It's the bike that I was allowed to start. It was always, when you can kick it through, we'll start it up.
Right.
And so, that was something. I think by the time I was 12 or 13, we were able to finally start it up.
Right. I mean, to have a motorcycle that's a family heirloom like that and that much sentimental value is a real rarity. So that's I can see how special that would be. And like I said, it's not about is it a 100 point perfect collector's item. It's about what it represented to your grandfather and his legacy and to your family. I mean that's
what it is.
That's so cool. That is so cool.
Exactly what it is. And what the neat thing was is after it had been at least 10 years since we've had it running, because we actually had it in the house for a while. And last year, Parker and I took it out and I said, hey, it's time we start this thing. So as it was always the case, and the same it was when I was a little kid, is just go through, give it the prep, put the battery in, and it started second kick. Nice. After all those years. And that's like, well, as my grandfather would say, well, that's an Indian.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that you've had in your garage for a long time. What else? I know you got we'll get to your latest acquisition. You wrote about it in your July column. But so what else do you have? Is like whether your daily riders or something like that. I know you've got.
Sure. I'll run through the list real quick. There's so along with the 53 Chief, there is a 1950 Chief that I had restored several years ago. That one's more the one that I ride periodically.
Sure.
I have a 2019 Indian FTR 1200. That's the flat track replica.
Very cool.
2018 Harley Heritage 114. Both of those are in the story Chasing Gene and Washie. I have the bike that I used for all the training and really the main motorcycle, and especially if I'm going to go to up riding somewhere, is a Yamaha Super Tenere, which has just been my kind of trusty steed.
Sure.
Then we get into some of the older stuff, and I'm not real old, but it's just, I have a 74 BMW R75 that's identical to the one that I had back in college and rode across the country. And the cool thing about that, Greg, is after all these years, getting one of these again, they're quirky motorcycles. And yet, because I put so many miles on that one and lived with it for so long, it's like picking up right where I left off. It's like, okay, reach down for the choke behind my knee, and I knew I didn't have to look. It's right there.
Right.
And where all the controls and everything, the way they work is it was just muscle memory that came right back. And that bike, by today's standards, has crappy brakes and not much power, and but puts a smile on my face like nothing else.
Right.
And that had been originally the original one that I had been my dad's, and that was my introduction to BMW motorcycles, which I rode for years and years. I have a 75 Yamaha XS650 that had been my son's that he was going to sell, and I said, well, I'll snag that from you because that's a fun little bike and it's in real nice shape. And I've been my latest thing has been picking up vintage Hondas. Some nice if I find a nice example at a good price, I've got over the past couple of years, I picked up a 67 Honda Dream. That's a 305. We have a 64 Honda Super Hawk that is actually Parker's bike that he's restored. Awesome. I have an unusual Honda. I guess they were really popular around the world, but not so much here, but a CD 175 that has 300 original miles. And there's and the latest thing has been a little 71 Honda Trail 90, which it's tiny, and yet that's another one where running it around the yard, I'm just having, I guess I'm in this flashback mode where it's just, I'm trying to, I don't know whether it's trying to relive something or what, or just re-enjoy some stuff that I experienced in the past. And that little Trail 90 is an absolute hoot.
Well, I mean, if you've been acquiring some old Hondas, then you know what the values of some of these old, Honda Trail 70s and 90s and stuff. It's like, even kind of basket case looking ones are fetching a fair price, because those are the motorcycles that people connect to their youth. It's how they learn to ride. Yeah. They used to do what you did. They rode around the yard. They rode with neighborhood kids. They did whatever. And so, we get to a certain age, as people, it's like you want to reconnect with, there's favorite songs from your youth that you want to listen to. And there's, favorite books. You're talking about Blue Highways. I read that when I was in high school. That was the seminal book that, like, my wanderlust that I still have to this day, I can trace back to certain books and experiences that I had. That ride in the, that trip in the van with my dad for a few weeks, reading books like Blue Highways. And so, so for you to have a motorcycle that, you can connect with, then you talk about that in your column in the July issue. It's like what it was like to sort of refamiliarize yourself with something that you spent hours and hours and hours doing and riding when you were a kid. That's
the hardest part is not making the sounds with my mouth.
yeah, exactly. That's cool. So wow, you got quite a few carburetors to clean and batteries to keep charged up and stuff. So
and that whole thing, which as you know too, I picked up I'm always looking for the new experience. So the unusual thing that has been a 2020 Royal Enfield 650 Interceptor with a cozy sidecar.
Yeah.
And
so you still have a sidecar. You do.
Yeah. A lot of people expected that to come unbolted. And I will tell you that all of my years of training and all the experience and everything else did not prepare me for that outfit. And
nothing does.
It's not a trike.
Nope.
It is not a motorcycle. It's not a car. It is its own unique beast with its own very unique handling characteristics. And once you figure out how they actually, or why they do what they do, and how you can actually control them, they're fun.
Yeah.
But without knowing that, you can get yourself in as I did. I ran it off. I hate to admit it, but I ran it right off the road. So
we tested a Ural gear up a couple, 5 or 6 years ago, and Tuttle did the main test, and it's got quite a bit of sidecar experience and really liked it. He likes kind of older quirky bikes anyway, but but I rode it home, and I didn't spend enough time with it to master it, and I was like, this thing is like, does not make sense to me. Like, it's just like braking and accelerating and so forth. And I took my wife Carrie in it, and she was like, she likes roller coasters and things like that. But she, like, that was the funnest, scariest ride I've ever had, because not that I was like flying the car trying to scare her, but it's just, it's weird dynamics. And I was trying to be as smooth and gentle as I could, but so it requires patience and effort to master something like a sidecar. So people that have them love them. People that don't, I'm kind of on the fence.
I will say, I mean, it's something that I find myself, now that I'm comfortable with it and I know what it does. You just have to be real careful about entering a right-hand turn slowly. But it's today. I went to needed to go pick up takeout food for lunch here for Amy and I, and I was like, that rig is perfect. I'll just throw the stuff in the sidecar. And so, anytime I've picked up fertilizer with it, I do all kinds of little errands with it. So it's fun from that standpoint. And it's such a novelty, and certainly gets attention. So that's always fun to talk to people about it.
Yeah, Justin Dawes, who works for Cycle World, has had a Ural sidecar that he puts his dog in all the time, and he's got one of the children. He loves to take it in the dirt, and the dog. Apparently, it's one of those things where he's got the kind of dog. He has the doggles and so forth. Is like the dog jumps into the car before he gets to the motor. Like, he just, like, the dog wants to go for a ride, and so he has a lot of fun. And the novelty value of being able to take your dog out for a ride or a companion or something like that, I'm sure is a lot of fun, because it's just a different experience. It's like having a top down on a little old sports car or something. It's just it's its own sort of experience. So so
no question.
Well, hey, anything else you want to talk about? I've been eating up a fair amount of your time. We can always do another episode, but anything else you want to plug or talk about? Like I said, people that read the magazine obviously love your writing. Those that listen to the podcast and haven't read your stuff definitely should pick up the magazine and read some of Eric's stuff. So,
well, thanks. I appreciate that. Hey, the one thing, but what does come up every once in a while is folks do ask about the Stayin Safe training program. And all I wanted to really mention real quickly on that is the pandemic kind of led to us stopping the tours. And, an odd, unexpected thing happened during that time. And that was I rediscovered the joys of actually getting out and riding for pleasure. And so it's been a little tough for me to get back into that. And we've been looking at other forms for Stayin Safe as well. But what I do want to encourage people to do is check out Motomark 1, the number 1. They are certified to run the Stayin Safe method. They are doing tours in the East and looking at some additional tours, starting to head into some of the Western states and everything too. So motomark1.com, motomark1.com is a great way to check out the Stayin Safe tours if that's what folks are interested in. Of course, people are always welcome to contact me with any questions or anything like that. Always happy to help out fellow riders.
Cool. Well, and we'll include links to Motomark 1 and your website in the show notes and so forth. So, hey, Eric, we don't talk often enough. I enjoy every conversation I have with you.
Likewise.
So, like I said, too often we're just exchanging emails, which is let's do this again. Let's have another conversation. Tell some more stories. I love it. So, thanks for coming on the show. It's great.
Thanks for having me, Greg. It's great to see you. Be
awesome.
Well.
For the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, I'm Greg Drevenstedt. Thanks for listening and keep the rubber side down. If you've enjoyed listening to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, please subscribe, leave us a positive rating, and tell your friends. We also encourage you to visit ridermagazine.com, where you can get the latest in motorcycle news and reviews and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. You can also subscribe to print and digital editions of Rider Magazine, which is published 12 times a year. Thanks again for listening.